This test method covers the procedures used to determine the flexural strength of concrete using a simple beam and third point loading in accordance with AASHTO T97. The equipment involved in this test is a testing machine with third point flexural loading apparatus that's capable of loading the specimen at a rate of 125 to 175 psi per minute. 2 leaf type feeler gauges, a 4 thousandths inch leaf type feeler gauge and a 15 thousandths inch feeler gauge. A machined straight edge. 4 leather shims, a 1/4 inch thick by 1 to 2 inches wide and as long as the specimen is wide. Calipers. And a tape measure or 24-inch long steel rule. And a water spray bottle. The span of the testing apparatus shall be within 2% of 3 times the depth of the specimen. Measure that span from lower bearing block to lower bearing block. For example, if a beam is exactly 6.00 inches in depth, the span shall be 18 inches plus or minus 2%, which is 36 hundredths of an inch. Measurements will be made after the beam has been tested because they are taken at the location of the fracture. Next, wipe the upper and lower bearing blocks to remove debris prior to placing the beam sample in the apparatus. Test the specimen as soon as possible after removing it from storage in a moist cure room or in water storage. Only take out one beam at a time so it does not have time to dry out. A spray bottle can be used to mist the beam to keep it moist. The beam has been placed in the Flexure Testing machine on its side so the bearing blocks are in contact with the molded sides of the beam. The beam has been centered over the bearing blocks on the machine using marks previously made. Make sure the load reading is 0. Apply 3 to 6% of the anticipated load to the beam. 300 to 500 pounds is typical for this load. With the load application paused, check for gaps between the bearing blocks and the beam. Using a 4 thousandths leaf type feeler gauge, check for gaps greater than 1 inch wide between the beam and the block. Check all 4 blocks, the top and bottom blocks, on both the front and the back. If no gaps are found, then continue testing the beam. If a gap is found using the 4 thousandths feeler gauge, then use the 15 thousandths leaf type feeler gauge to check for 1 inch or wider gaps on all 4 blocks. If no gaps are found, the beam must be ground, capped, or shimmed before testing. If a gap is found using the 15 thousandths feeler gauge, the beam must be ground or capped before testing. Apply the load to the beam continuously and without shock at a metered rate of 125 to 175 psi per minute to failure. Record the peak load reading indicated by the machine after failure has occurred. Next, we will measure the specimen. Please turn to the last page of Topic F in your textbook to find the worksheet for AASHTO T97, which we'll use to record those measurements and perform calculations.